Hello everyone, welcome to the Mysterious Stories channel, where you'll discover the most mysterious, scary, and fascinating stories. Make sure to turn up the volume and get ready for a spine-chilling experience you won't forget. The dense jungle canopy of Quang Tri province loomed ominously overhead as the soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division made their way through the treacherous terrain. The air was thick with humidity, and every step felt heavier, as if the very ground beneath them resisted their advance. The mission was clear: secure Hill 875, a strategic point that had seen more bloodshed than any man should witness. Yet, as they moved deeper into the jungle, a growing unease gnawed at the edges of their consciousness. Sergeant Michael Hayes, a battle-hardened veteran, led his men with a sense of purpose, but even he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The radio crackled occasionally, but the usual banter and light-hearted chatter were absent. The men were on edge, and the jungle seemed unusually quiet, as if it held its breath, waiting for something. "We're close," Hayes muttered, glancing at the map and then at the silent trees surrounding them. He signaled for a halt, allowing his men a brief respite. They had been moving for hours, and the oppressive atmosphere was beginning to take its toll. Private First Class Tom Edwards, the youngest in the squad, took a swig of water and wiped the sweat from his brow. "Sergeant, doesn't it feel off to you? Like something's watching us?" Hayes looked at Edwards, his expression stern but not dismissive. "Focus, Edwards. The enemy could be anywhere." Edwards nodded, but the sense of dread wouldn't leave him. He wasn't the only one feeling it. Corporal James Parker, one of the more seasoned soldiers, had noticed the change in the jungle as well. "Sarge, this place, it's too quiet. No birds, no insects, it's like the jungle's dead." Hayes didn't reply immediately. He had been in enough combat situations to know that instincts like these were not to be ignored. "Stay sharp, everyone," he finally said, his voice low but commanding. "We move in 5. As the men prepared to move out, a sudden rustling in the underbrush caught their attention. Weapons were immediately raised, fingers on triggers, but what emerged from the foliage was not an enemy soldier. It was a small, ragged-looking dog, its fur matted and its eyes wild with fear. It darted across their path and disappeared into the jungle. "What the hell?" whispered Private Jack Ramirez, lowering his rifle slightly. "How'd a dog end up out here?" Parker shrugged, but there was no humor in his voice. "Dogs don't get this deep into the jungle unless they're lost or something worse." The men exchanged uneasy glances, but there was no time to dwell on it. The mission was priority, and Hill 875 awaited. As they resumed their march, the oppressive silence returned, wrapping around them like a shroud. The climb toward Hill 875 was grueling, each step an effort against the steep incline and the weight of their gear. As they neared the base of the hill, the sky began to darken, clouds gathering ominously above. The air grew cooler, and a mist began to roll in, thickening with every passing minute. "This place is cursed," Ramirez muttered under his breath as they set up a temporary camp. The men busied themselves, securing the perimeter and preparing for the next day's assault. But the mist continued to close in, and with it came a palpable sense of dread. As night fell, the camp was eerily quiet, the usual noises of a military encampment subdued by the thickening fog. The men huddled around small fires, trying to ward off the cold that seemed to seep into their very bones. But it wasn't just the cold that chilled them, it was the sense that they were not alone. Hayes took the first watch, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the camp's perimeter. The mist obscured everything beyond a few feet, turning the jungle into a maze of shadows. Every rustle, every creak of the trees, set his nerves on edge. He had faced the enemy many times, but this was different. As the hours dragged on, Hayes thought he saw movement in the fog, shapes that didn't belong to trees or bushes. At first, he dismissed it as a trick of the light, fatigue playing with his mind. But then he heard it, a faint whisper, carried on the wind, just at the edge of hearing. His grip tightened on his rifle, and he strained to listen. The whisper came again, a little clearer this time, though the words were unintelligible. It sounded like a voice, distant and forlorn, but there was no one out there, not that he could see. Anyway, Hayes shook his head, trying to clear the fog from his mind as well as his vision. But the whisper persisted, growing louder, more insistent. It was as if the very air around him was speaking, beckoning him towards something unseen. "Who's there?" Hayes hissed into the darkness, his voice barely above a whisper. But there was no response, only the rustling of the mist as it swirled around him. The whispering continued, relentless, until Hayes could no longer ignore it. He rose from his position, rifle at the ready, and moved cautiously toward the edge of the camp. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to wake the others, but he couldn't. Something drew him forward, deeper into the fog, and then he saw just beyond the trees, a faint glow, like a lantern flickering in the night. But it wasn't the light that chilled him to the core, it was the figure standing beneath it, a soldier, dressed in tattered fatigues, his face obscured by the mist, stood silently, watching Hayes. The figure was still, unnaturally so, as if it was frozen in time. "Identify yourself," Hayes demanded, his voice stronger now, but there was no response. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, it just stood there, silent and menacing. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, leaving Hayes alone in the suffocating fog. He stumbled back to the camp, his mind reeling. He had seen a lot of strange things in his time, but this was something else entirely. As he took his place back on watch, the whispers faded, but the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of his sanity. The night dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. And though the figure did not reappear, the men could feel its presence, lingering in the darkness, watching, waiting. As dawn finally broke, the mist began to lift, revealing the jungle in all its ominous beauty. But the soldiers of the 101st Airborne knew that something had changed, that the hill they were about to ascend was not just another objective. It was a place where the past clung to the present, where the dead refused to stay buried. And Hill 875 was waiting for them. The morning came with an unsettling stillness, the kind that precedes a storm. The sun barely pierced the thick canopy above, casting long shadows across the soldiers as they prepared for the day's assault on Hill 875. The men moved with an unspoken urgency, each of them feeling the weight of the mission and the lingering unease from the night before. Sergeant Michael Hayes, still shaken by his encounter with the mysterious figure in the mist, did his best to maintain his composure. He couldn't afford to let his men see his fear, but it gnawed at him, a constant reminder of the inexplicable presence that had watched him in the darkness. As the soldiers gathered around for a final briefing, Lieutenant Harris laid out the plan. "We'll advance in staggered formation. The hill's steep, and the enemy knows we're coming. Keep your heads low and your eyes sharp. We've got air support on standby, but it's up to us to take this hill." The men nodded, though the usual murmurs of agreement were absent. Instead, there was only silence, punctuated by the occasional cough or rustle of gear. Hayes could feel the tension in the air, thicker than the humidity that clung to them. Private Edwards, standing close to Hayes, whispered, "Sarge, you sure we're alone out here? Last night felt wrong." Hayes glanced at the young soldier, his face set in a grim line. "Focus on the mission, Edwards. We've got a job to do." But Edwards wasn't alone in his unease. Corporal Parker, normally the stoic one, was unusually quiet, his eyes darting toward the tree line as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. Ramirez, who often cracked jokes to lighten the mood, hadn't said a word all morning. The soldiers began their ascent, the steep incline forcing them to move slowly, cautiously. The jungle around them was dense, every branch and leaf seeming to reach out and snag at their uniforms. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the sound of their footsteps and the occasional distant rumble of artillery. As they climbed higher, the fog that had lifted with the dawn began to creep back in, tendrils of mist swirling around their legs. It was subtle at first, a light haze that barely hindered their vision. But with each step, it grew thicker, heavier, until the soldiers could barely see a few feet in front of them. "Damn this fog," Parker muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. "It's like the jungle doesn't want us here." Hayes didn't respond, his focus entirely on the path ahead. But he couldn't deny that the fog was more than just a natural phenomenon. It felt alive, pressing in on them, obscuring their view and muffling their senses. The jungle around them seemed to close in, the trees and undergrowth becoming a twisted maze. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the fog, the unmistakable sound of a gunshot. The soldiers dropped to the ground, weapons at the ready, eyes scanning the dense mist for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, only the swirling fog and the oppressive silence that followed. "Where the hell did that come from?" Ramirez whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't see anything," Parker replied, his grip tightening on his rifle. Hayes motioned for the men to hold their positions, his heart pounding in his chest. The fog made it impossible to tell where the shot had come from, or if it was even real. The echoes seemed to bounce off the trees, distorting the sound and adding to the confusion. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity, but no further shots came. The silence was deafening, and the men remained crouched, eyes wide with fear and anticipation. "Everyone stay sharp," Hayes ordered, his voice low and tense. "We move forward, slow and steady. Watch your flanks." They continued their advance, every step measured and deliberate. The fog thickened further, turning the jungle into an impenetrable wall of gray. The soldiers moved like shadows, their movements careful and precise, but the sense of being watched persisted, an unseen presence lurking just beyond their vision. Then, out of the fog, they heard a faint whisper, like the one Hayes had heard the night before. It was barely audible, a ghostly murmur that seemed to come from all around them. "What the hell is that?" Edwards asked, his voice trembling. Hayes felt a chill run down his spine. "Keep moving. Don't stop." But the whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling the air with their eerie cadence. The words were still indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable pleading, desperate, as if the very air was crying out for help. Parker froze, his eyes wide with terror. "Sarge, I see something." Hayes turned to where Parker was pointing, but all he saw was the thick fog. "Where? What do you see?" Parker's breathing quickened, his voice trembling. It's them, the ones who died here. I can see their faces in the fog." Hayes strained his eyes, trying to make sense of the swirling mist. But then, as if the fog itself parted to reveal the truth, he saw them faint, ghostly figures, barely discernible, but there, watching them. The faces of soldiers long dead, their eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. The sight sent a wave of terror through Hayes. He had seen death before, but never like this. These were not the bodies of fallen comrades. These were spirits, trapped in the fog, unable to move on. "We have to get out of here," Hayes said, his voice breaking. "This place is cursed." But there was no escape. The fog thickened around them, the whispers turning into wails, the faces in the mist growing more distinct, more tormented. The soldiers were surrounded, the jungle closing in on them from all sides. "Move, move now," Hayes shouted, desperate to break free from the nightmare. The soldiers scrambled to their feet, pushing forward through the dense undergrowth, but the fog clung to them, the ghostly faces following their every step. The whispers grew louder, filling their minds with despair, eroding their will to fight. As they reached a small clearing, the fog seemed to pull back slightly, revealing a crumbling, overgrown bunker, a relic from battles long past. But the reprieve was short-lived. The figures in the fog were closing in, their wails piercing the air, a chorus of anguish and torment. "We need to take cover," Hayes shouted, pointing to the bunker. "Inside. Now!" The men rushed into the bunker, the walls offering a momentary sense of protection. But the fog pressed against the entrance, the ghostly figures lingering just outside, their eyes fixed on the soldiers with a malevolent intensity. Inside the bunker, the air was thick with tension. The soldiers huddled together, their faces pale, their breathing ragged. The whispers continued, now more distinct, the voices of the dead calling out to them, accusing, pleading. What the hell is happening? Ramirez asked, his voice shaking. This can't be real. But it was real, and Hayes knew it. The fog, the faces, the voices, they were all too real. And as the soldiers tried to catch their breath, the realization hit them. They were not alone on this hill. The spirits of the fallen were here, trapped in the fog, and they were not happy to see the living. As the soldiers prepared for the night ahead, the fog outside the bunker thickened once more, the ghostly figures becoming more solid, more tangible. The haunting was only beginning, and Hill 875 had more horrors to reveal. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, plunging the jungle into a thick, oppressive darkness. Inside the crumbling bunker, the air was stifling, filled with the scent of sweat, fear, and the ever-present mustiness of decay. The soldiers huddled close together, their eyes wide and alert, ears straining to catch any sound beyond the thick concrete walls. Sergeant Michael Hayes sat with his back against the cold wall, his rifle resting across his knees. He could feel the tension in the room, a tangible thing that wrapped itself around each man, squeezing tighter with every passing minute. The fog outside had grown even thicker, pressing against the small openings of the bunker like a living thing, pulsating with a sinister energy. The ghostly whispers had never truly stopped. They ebbed and flowed, sometimes barely audible, other times rising to a crescendo that made the men cover their ears in desperate attempts to block them out. The voices were different now, no longer just the faint murmurs of the lost, but insistent, angry. They were being watched, and the spirits were growing restless. Private Edwards broke the silence, his voice a shaky whisper. "Sarge, do you think they're out there right now, just waiting for us?" Hayes didn't want to answer. He didn't want to admit that he felt it too, that gnawing dread that there was something just beyond the walls, something that wanted them gone. But he couldn't lie, not now. "They're out there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But we're not going to let them get to us. We've made it this far, and we'll make it out of here." His words were meant to be reassuring, but the fear in his eyes betrayed him. The men weren't fooled. They knew that the situation was beyond their control. Whatever was haunting them was not something they could fight with bullets and grenades. Corporal Parker, who had been silent since they entered the bunker, finally spoke. His voice was flat, almost resigned. "My granddad used to tell stories. You know, he fought in the Great War, said there were places on the battlefield where the dead didn't rest. He said if you listen real close, you could hear them calling out, trying to drag you down with them." Ramirez shivered, wrapping his arms around himself as if trying to ward off the chill that had seeped into the bunker. "We're in one of those places, aren't we? This hill. It's like it's alive, like it remembers everything that happened here." Hayes nodded grimly. "This place has seen too much death. The ground's soaked with it, and those souls, they're not at peace. We've disturbed something by coming here, something that was better left alone." The men fell silent again, the weight of Hayes' words settling over them like a shroud. Outside, the fog swirled and pressed closer, carrying with it the voices of the dead. Every now and then, the men would catch glimpses of movement through the narrow slits in the bunker walls, flickers of shadowy figures, half-formed and twisted by the fog. The faces of the dead, pale and gaunt, stared back at them, eyes hollow and filled with an otherworldly despair. The night dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. The air inside the bunker grew heavy, suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Hayes tried to keep the men focused, rotating watches, keeping them busy with small tasks, anything to keep their minds from dwelling on the horrors outside. But there was no escaping the oppressive atmosphere, the feeling that they were being slowly surrounded, their escape routes cut off by forces they couldn't understand. Hours passed, and the men's nerves frayed further. Every creak of the bunker, every gust of wind outside, made them jump. Even the most mundane sounds took on a sinister quality, as if the jungle itself was conspiring against them. Then, in the dead of night, the voices outside the bunker rose again, louder and more desperate than ever. They were no longer just whispers but cries pleading, sorrowful, accusing. The soldiers could almost make out the words now, fragments of sentences that sent chills down their spines. Why? Why did you leave us? Help us, please. You must join us. The voices seemed to come from everywhere, echoing off the walls, making it impossible to tell where they were coming from. Hayes' heart pounded in his chest, his instincts screaming at him to do something, anything, but he knew there was nothing he could do. These were not enemies he could fight. They were the tortured remnants of men who had once stood where they were now. Men who had died on this cursed hill and had never left. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, as if something had slammed against the bunker's door. The soldiers jumped to their feet, weapons at the ready, eyes wide with terror. Another bang followed, and then another, each one louder than the last. What the hell is that? Ramirez shouted, his voice cracking with fear. Hold your positions. Hayes barked, trying to keep the men from panicking. But even he could feel the cold sweat running down his back, the primal fear that had taken hold of him. The banging continued, growing more frantic, more insistent, as if whatever was outside was desperate to get in. The soldiers pointed their rifles at the door, their fingers trembling on the triggers. But the door held, the thick steel resisting whatever force was trying to breach it. Then, as suddenly as it started, the banging stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the ragged breathing of the men inside the bunker. They waited, tense, expecting the worst, but nothing happened. The fog outside seemed to pull back slightly, the oppressive weight lifting just enough for them to breathe again. Hayes lowered his rifle, his hands still shaking. Everyone okay? The men nodded, though their faces were pale, their eyes wide with fear. Whatever had been out there, it was gone for now. But the night was far from over, and the soldiers knew it. They could feel the presence outside, lurking just beyond the walls, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The fog might have receded, but it wasn't gone, and neither were the spirits of Hill 875. As the men settled back into their positions, the fear in the bunker was palpable. They were trapped in a nightmare, surrounded by the vengeful dead, and there was no telling how long they could hold out. But they had no choice. They had to survive the night, whatever it took. The night was black as pitch, and the fog had grown thicker, turning the world outside the bunker into an impenetrable wall of swirling gray. The air inside felt suffocating. The walls seemed to close in, and every breath the soldiers took felt like it was laden with dread. The bunker, once a refuge, had become a tomb, sealing them in with something far more terrifying than the Viet Cong. Sergeant Michael Hayes could feel the tension rising with every passing minute. The men were on edge, their nerves frayed to the breaking point. Private Edwards sat in the corner, muttering under his breath, his eyes darting back and forth as if seeing things that weren't there. Corporal Parker was no better. He gripped his rifle so tightly that his knuckles had turned white, his gaze fixed on the door, waiting for whatever was out there to come crashing in. It wasn't just fear, it was something deeper, primal. A feeling that they were being hunted, not by men, but by something far worse. The fog outside seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, pressing against the bunker, seeping into their minds. The ghostly whispers had grown louder, more insistent, filling the air with an overwhelming sense of despair. Then it started. A low, guttural moan echoed through the bunker, reverberating off the walls. It was followed by another, and then another, until the air was thick with the sound. It was like the wails of the damned, rising up from the depths of the earth, chilling the soldiers to the bone. What the hell is that? Ramirez's voice was barely a whisper, his eyes wide with terror. Hayes swallowed hard, trying to keep his own fear in check. Stay calm, it's just the wind. But even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. This was no ordinary sound. It was something far more sinister, something that clawed at the edges of their sanity. The moaning grew louder, more intense, filling the bunker with a maddening cacophony. It was as if the walls themselves were screaming, the cries of the dead trapped within them. The fog outside began to thicken, turning from a soft gray to a deep, swirling black. It pressed against the small openings in the bunker, oozing through the cracks like a living thing. The soldiers watched in horror as the darkness began to seep into the room, filling it with an unnatural cold that bit into their bones. Private Edwards let out a strangled cry, backing away from the encroaching darkness. "It's coming for us! It's coming for us!" Hayes tried to steady him, but his own hands were shaking. The darkness was alive, crawling along the floor, reaching for them with tendrils of shadow. It was unlike anything they had ever seen, something out of a nightmare, something that shouldn't exist in the waking world. The air grew colder, each breath like inhaling shards of ice. The moaning turned into a deafening wail, the sound so intense that it felt like it was drilling into their skulls. The soldiers clutched their heads, trying to block out the noise, but there was no escape. The darkness was everywhere, wrapping around them, squeezing the life out of them. Suddenly, the darkness coalesced into a shape of figure, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that burned with an otherworldly light. It stood in the center of the bunker, its form shifting and twisting, as if made of smoke and shadows. The figure's mouth opened, and from it came a voice that was not a voice, a sound so terrible that it defied description, a sound that spoke directly to their souls. "Why do you disturb us? Why do you come to this place of death?" The voice resonated deep within their minds, bypassing their ears entirely. It was the voice of the hill itself, the collective agony of the souls who had perished there, given form and substance. The soldiers could feel it tearing at their minds, filling them with images of death and destruction, visions of the battles that had been fought on that cursed hill, the blood that had soaked into the earth, the screams of the dying. Corporal Parker fell to his knees, his face contorted in terror. "Please, we didn't mean to. We didn't know." The figure loomed over him, its hollow eyes burning brighter. "You are not the first, and you will not be the last. This hill is ours. It belongs to the dead." The darkness swirled around them, the air growing so cold that their breath froze in their throats. The soldiers huddled together, their rifles useless against this supernatural force. They were soldiers, trained to face death on the battlefield, but this was something else entirely, something that defied their understanding, something that no amount of training could prepare them for. Hayes gritted his teeth, trying to fight off the terror that was threatening to overwhelm him. He had to keep the men together, had to find a way to get them out of this nightmare. But the figure's presence was overwhelming, its power suffocating. It was as if the very essence of death had descended upon them, a force that could not be reasoned with, could not be fought. The figure raised a hand, and the darkness surged forward, enveloping the soldiers in a suffocating embrace. The cold was unbearable, like being plunged into the icy depths of the ocean. They couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The darkness was all-consuming, swallowing them whole. And then, as quickly as it had come, it was gone. The darkness receded, the figure dissolved into smoke, and the bunker was once again silent. The soldiers gasped for air, their bodies trembling, their minds reeling from the encounter. They had faced death before, but never like this, never in a form so terrifying, so relentless. Hayes looked around at his men, seeing the fear etched into their faces. They were close to breaking, and he couldn't blame them. They had been pushed to the edge, and the abyss was staring back at them, but they had survived. Somehow, they had survived. "We need to get out of here," Hayes said, his voice hoarse. At first light, we're moving out. No one argued. The bunker, once a place of refuge, had become a prison. The spirits of Hill 875 had made it clear they were not welcome here. As the soldiers settled down to wait for the dawn, the fog outside began to lift, revealing the twisted, scarred landscape of the hill. But the terror of the night was not so easily dispelled. The men could still feel the presence of the dead, lingering just beyond the edge of their vision, watching, waiting. Hayes leaned back against the wall, closing his eyes for a moment. But the images of the night played on the backs of his eyelids, the figure of shadow and smoke, the hollow eyes that burned with the fire of the damned. He could still hear the voice, echoing in his mind. This hill is ours. It belongs to the dead. They had survived the night, but the horror was far from over. The spirits of Hill 875 were not done with them yet. And as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the soldiers knew that the battle for their souls had only just begun. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the dense canopy of trees, casting long, eerie shadows across the bunker. The soldiers had been up all night, their eyes bloodshot, their nerves frayed to the breaking point. The darkness that had almost consumed them was gone, but the terror lingered in the air like a heavy fog, thick and oppressive. Sergeant Michael Hayes rubbed his tired eyes, trying to shake off the lingering dread that clung to him like a second skin. His mind replayed the events of the night over and over, the ghastly figure of smoke and shadow, the chilling voice that had spoken directly to their souls. No amount of training could prepare a man for something like that. The men were gathered around the remnants of a small fire, its weak flames offering little comfort. Private Edwards sat with his back against the wall, staring blankly into the distance, while Corporal Parker kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting the shadows to spring to life at any moment. Ramirez, usually the joker of the group, was silent, his hands trembling slightly as he fiddled with his rifle. "We can't stay here," Hayes finally said, breaking the uneasy silence. "This hill, it's cursed. We need to get off it as soon as possible." The men nodded in agreement, their faces pale and drawn. They were battle-hardened soldiers, but the events of the night had shaken them to their core. They had faced the Viet Cong, endured the brutal conditions of war, but nothing had prepared them for the horrors that Hill 875 had unleashed. As they began to pack up their gear, the jungle around them came to life with the sounds of the early morning. The distant calls of birds, the rustling of leaves in the wind, but beneath it all, there was an unnatural stillness, a sense of foreboding that hung over the hill like a dark cloud. "Sergeant, do you really think we'll make it out of here?" Parker's voice was shaky, the fear still evident in his eyes. Hayes hesitated, searching for words of reassurance that he wasn't sure he believed. "We'll make it, Parker. Just stick together, and we'll get through this." The truth was, Hayes didn't know if they would make it. The night had shown them that the hill was no ordinary battlefield. It was a place where the line between the living and the dead was blurred, where the horrors of war had left a scar on the very fabric of reality. As they made their way down the hill, the air grew thick with humidity, the oppressive heat of the jungle closing in around them. The trail was narrow and treacherous, winding through dense undergrowth and steep inclines. The further they descended, the more the atmosphere seemed to change. The jungle, usually alive with the sounds of nature, was unnervingly quiet. A few hours into their descent, they came across the remains of an old campfire, the charred logs still faintly smoking. Around it, the ground was littered with discarded gear helmets, canteens, even a few rifles, left behind as if the soldiers who had been there had fled in a hurry. Whoever was here didn't stick around long. Ramirez muttered, kicking at one of the helmets with the toe of his boot. "Wonder what scared them off." "Let's not find out," Hayes said, his eyes scanning the surrounding jungle. "Keep moving." The trail grew steeper as they pressed on, the dense foliage closing in around them. The heat was suffocating, sweat dripping from their brows as they struggled to keep their footing. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, had them on edge, their eyes darting nervously to the shadows that seemed to stretch and twist with every step they took. It wasn't long before they started hearing it again, the faint whispers carried on the wind, just beyond the edge of hearing. The same ghostly voices that had tormented them during the night, now haunting their every step. "Did you hear that?" Edwards whispered, his voice trembling. "It's them, the voices." "Shut up, Edwards," Hayes snapped, trying to keep his own fear in check. "It's just the wind." But he knew it wasn't just the wind. The voices were real, and they were growing louder, more insistent, as if urging them to turn back, to abandon their attempt to leave the hill. As they rounded a bend in the trail, the jungle opened up into a small clearing, and they came face to face with something that made their blood run cold. In the center of the clearing stood an old, dilapidated shrine, its stone walls covered in moss and vines. The shrine was ancient, its origins lost to time, and yet there was something deeply unsettling about it. The air around it felt heavy, oppressive, as if the very ground was tainted by the horrors that had been committed there. "What the hell is this place?" Parker asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Hayes didn't answer. He was transfixed by the sight of the shrine, a deep sense of dread settling in the pit of his stomach. There was something wrong about this place, something that defied explanation. The jungle around them was still and silent, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. Without warning, the voices returned, louder this time, filling the air with a cacophony of whispers and cries. The soldiers clutched their heads, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. The voices were everywhere, all around them, inside their heads, speaking in a language they couldn't understand. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble, the earth shaking as if something was trying to claw its way to the surface. The shrine seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the air around it crackling with unseen forces. "Move, we need to get out of here," he shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the rising roar of the earth. The ground split open with a deafening crack, and from the gaping maw emerged a figure, twisted and grotesque, its form barely recognizable as human. It was covered in tattered remnants of a uniform, its flesh rotting and decayed, but its eyes burned with a malevolent fire, the same unholy light that they had seen in the bunker. The soldiers stumbled back in horror as the figure advanced, its mouth opening in a terrible, guttural scream that echoed through the jungle. It was a scream of pain, of rage, of torment, and it cut through them like a knife. "Run! Run!" Ramirez screamed, and the soldiers turned and fled, their hearts pounding in their chests, the monstrous figure in pursuit. They barreled down the trail, the jungle closing in around them, the whispers and cries of the dead growing louder with every step. The ground beneath them was unstable, shifting and buckling as if the hill itself was trying to swallow them whole. They ran blindly, their only thought to escape the nightmare that had overtaken them. But no matter how fast they ran, the presence of the hill was always there, closing in on them, suffocating them with its malevolence. As they stumbled through the dense foliage, the trees seemed to twist and warp, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, trying to ensnare them. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the ground slick with blood and mud. The jungle was alive with the ghosts of the past, their screams of agony and despair filling the air. Hayes could feel the darkness closing in, his vision blurring as exhaustion and terror took their toll. But he couldn't stop, he couldn't let it end here. He had to get his men out of this cursed place, no matter what. Suddenly, the trail opened up into a vast, desolate expanse, the remains of a battlefield long forgotten. The ground was littered with the detritus of war-rusted weapons, torn uniforms, and the skeletal remains of soldiers who had died in this forsaken place. And there, in the center of the field, stood a figure tall and gaunt, its form wreathed in shadows. It was the same figure they had encountered in the bunker, the same figure that had haunted their every step. The figure raised its hand, and the ground beneath them erupted in a torrent of fire and smoke. The soldiers were thrown to the ground, the heat searing their skin, the force of the explosion nearly deafening them. Hayes struggled to his feet, his ears ringing, his vision blurred. The figure was gone, but the battlefield around them was alive with the spirits of the dead, their twisted forms writhing and contorting in agony. There was no escape. The hill had claimed them, and there was no way out. As the darkness closed in, Hayes could only watch in horror as his men were dragged down, one by one, their screams echoing through the night. And then there was only silence. The hill, once again, was still. The battlefield was a nightmarish landscape of smoke, fire, and shadows. The once lush jungle had been transformed into a hellish wasteland. The trees twisted and blackened, the ground scorched and barren. The air was thick with the acrid stench of burning flesh and the faint, ghostly whispers of the dead, echoing across the ruined landscape. Sergeant Michael Hayes stood alone in the midst of the devastation, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His body was battered and bruised, his uniform torn and blooded. He clutched his rifle tightly, the cold metal slick with sweat, his knuckles white with tension. Around him, the twisted remnants of his squad lay scattered, their lifeless bodies twisted in grotesque poses, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. The hill had claimed them all, one by one, until only Hayes remained. He was the last man standing, the final survivor of a doomed mission. The spirits of the dead had risen from their graves to claim their vengeance, and now they had come for him. In the distance, the figure of darkness loomed, its form wreathed in shadow and flame. It was the same malevolent entity that had tormented them from the start, the same figure that had driven his men to madness and despair. Its eyes burned with a fierce, otherworldly light, and its voice echoed in his mind, a chorus of pain and suffering that threatened to drive him to the brink of insanity. "You cannot escape," the voice whispered, cold and relentless. "You belong to this place, as do all who have come before you." Hayes gritted his teeth, forcing himself to remain focused. He had to finish this, he had to end the nightmare, once and for all. The men he had sworn to protect were gone, but he would not let their deaths be in vain. He would face the darkness head-on, no matter the cost. As he moved forward, his boots crunching on the scorched earth, the shadows around him seemed to pulse and shift, closing in on him from all sides. The ground beneath his feet trembled, the air around him growing thick and oppressive. The hill was alive with malevolent energy, and it was all focused on him. He raised his rifle, aiming it at the dark figure in the distance. His hands shook, his vision blurred, but he forced himself to steady his aim. This was his last stand, his final act of defiance against the forces of darkness that had claimed so many lives. The figure moved closer, its form growing more distinct with each step. It was a grotesque mockery of a human, its flesh charred and blackened, its eyes hollow and empty. It was the embodiment of death itself, a harbinger of doom that had risen from the ashes of the battlefield to claim its final victim. "Come on, you bastard," Hayes muttered through gritted teeth. "Come and get me." The figure stopped a few feet away, its gaze locked on Hayes. The air between them crackled with tension, the weight of 1,000 unspoken horrors pressing down on him. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The battlefield was silent, the only sound the distant crackling of fire and the faint whispers of the dead. Hayes could feel the presence of the spirits all around him, watching, waiting for the final confrontation. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, the figure lunged at him, its clawed hands outstretched. Hayes fired, the recoil of the rifle jolting through his body, the sound of the gunshot echoing across the battlefield. The bullet struck the figure in the chest, but it didn't stop. It kept coming, relentless, unstoppable, its eyes burning with a malevolent light. Hayes fired again and again, each shot tearing through the figure's form, but it was like shooting at smoke. The bullets passed through without effect, the figure's advance unimpeded. Desperation clawed at Hayes' mind as the figure closed the distance. He could feel the cold grip of fear tightening around his heart, the sense of impending doom that had haunted him since the start of the mission. He had known it would end this way. He had known, deep down, that there was no escape from the hill's curse. The figure reached him, its hand closing around his throat with a vice-like grip. Hayes gasped, struggling to breathe as the world around him grew dark. The figure's face was inches from his own, its eyes burning with an unholy fire, its breath hot and rancid against his skin. "You will join them," the figure whispered, its voice a low, guttural rasp. "You will never leave this place." Hayes felt his strength fading, his vision growing dim. The life was being choked out of him, the last remnants of his will slipping away. But even as the darkness closed in, he refused to give in. He would not let the hill win, he would not let his men's deaths be for nothing. With the last of his strength, Hayes reached for the knife strapped to his belt. He pulled it free, the blade glinting in the dim light, and plunged it into the figure's chest. The figure recoiled, its grip loosening, and Hayes took the opportunity to push it away, gasping for breath as he stumbled back. The figure screamed, a sound that was more than just a noise. It was a wave of pure, unadulterated pain, a howl of anguish that resonated through the very earth itself. The ground beneath their feet shook violently, and the air was filled with the crackling energy of a storm about to break. The figure writhed and twisted, the knife buried deep in its chest, its form beginning to disintegrate into a swirling vortex of shadow and flame. The battlefield around them was consumed by the storm, the trees and earth torn apart by the violent forces at play. The spirits of the dead howled in unison, their voices rising in a crescendo of agony and despair. Hayes fell to his knees, the weight of the hill's curse pressing down on him with unbearable force. He could feel the darkness closing in, the spirits of the dead reaching out to claim him, to drag him down into the abyss. But he would not go quietly. He had faced the darkness, and he had fought back. As the figure finally disintegrated, the storm reached its peak. The ground beneath Hayes split open, and the very fabric of reality seemed to tear apart. He was engulfed in a maelstrom of fire and shadow, his senses overwhelmed by the sheer force of the hill's malevolence. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The storm dissipated, the shadows receded, and the battlefield was silent once more. Hayes collapsed onto the ground, his body spent, his mind teetering on the edge of madness. The hill was quiet, the spirits of the dead finally at rest. The nightmare was over, but at what cost? He was the last man standing, the sole survivor of a mission that had gone horribly wrong. As he lay there, staring up at the sky, Hayes knew that he would never be the same again. The hill had taken everything from him, his men, his sanity, his very soul. He had faced the darkness and survived, but he would carry the scars of that encounter for the rest of his life. The haunting of Hill 875 would become just another story, passed down through the ranks of soldiers, a cautionary tale about the horrors of war and the spirits that linger in the places where so much blood has been spilled. But for Hayes, it would be more than just a story. It would be a living nightmare, one that would haunt him until his dying day. And as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Sergeant Michael Hayes closed his eyes, letting the darkness take him one final time. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, Mystical Tales, so you won't miss out on more eerie and thrilling tales in the future. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.